Please don't do that. It hurts down there.
Please don't do that. It hurts down there. The words tore from the giant woman's lips the moment Jacob Thornwood's calloused hands reached toward her in the back of his wagon, her massive frame trembling despite being nearly 6'3" of pure Norwegian strength. Just 30 minutes ago, he'd bought her, this towering bride with a burlap sack over her head, for $3 at the filthiest auction in Montana Territory, outbidding men who'd laughed at her size, at her foreignness, at the way she'd fought her captors. But when the rancher finally opened that sack on her head back at the auction, he froze, completely paralyzed by what he saw beneath that rough fabric. Something that made his heart stop and his hands shake. Now, as she pleaded, "Please don't do that. It hurts down there." Clutching her body in agony, Jacob realized he'd just bought a woman whose pain ran deeper than he could have imagined. Jacob jerked his hands back like he'd touched fire, his weathered face going white as Montana snow. The woman, this stranger he'd just purchased like livestock, pressed herself against the wagon's wooden side, her bound wrists crossed over her chest, blue eyes wide with terror that made his stomach twist. He could see it now in the fading sunlight, the way she held her ribs, the slight hitch in her breathing, the way her whole body flinched when the wagon wheel hit even the smallest rock in the dirt road. His mind raced to dark places, to the worst possibilities, to the kind of cruelty that made grown men into monsters. What had they done to her before he'd found her? What had those animals at the auction done while she'd been helpless with that sack over her head? The thought made rage bloom hot in his chest, made his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. But the woman didn't need his rage right now. She needed something he wasn't sure he remembered how to give anymore. She needed gentleness. She needed safety. She needed to know that not every man's touch ended in pain. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Jacob said, keeping his voice low and steady the way he did with spooked horses. "I swear on my life, ma'am. You cried out. I thought maybe you needed help getting down from the wagon." He gestured toward his ranch house in the distance. A modest cabin tucked against pine-covered mountains that looked like they were painted purple in the evening light. "We're almost home. That's where you'll be staying. You'll have the bedroom. I'll sleep in the barn." The woman stared at him like he was speaking a language from another planet. Maybe he was. Her lips moved, forming words in something that sounded like music, all rolling sounds and soft consonants. Norwegian, he guessed. She was trying to explain something, her large hands gesturing frantically toward her legs, her side, her shoulders. But every movement made her wince and bite back another cry. And then Jacob saw it, really saw it. The hem of her plain brown dress had ridden up slightly from her frantic movements, and in the golden hour light he could see her calves, covered in bruises so deep they looked black, some still crusted with dried blood where the skin had split open. His breath caught in his throat. Not assault. Beatings. They'd beaten her so badly she could barely move, and when he'd reached to help her, she'd thought he was coming to hurt her more. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and even though she didn't understand English, she understood the horror in his voice. She started crying then, not loud, dramatic sobs, but quiet, broken sounds that a person makes when they've learned that crying doesn't bring help, only more pain. Jacob felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid since the day he'd buried his wife and newborn daughter 8 years ago. He'd bought this woman on impulse, unable to stomach watching her be sold to men who'd seen the fear in her eyes and bid anyway. He told himself he was doing a good deed, saving her from a worse fate. But looking at her now, this towering, terrified woman who'd been beaten within an inch of her life and sold for the price of a decent meal, Jacob realized he hadn't saved anyone. He'd just bought himself a responsibility he had no idea how to handle. The wagon creaked to a stop in front of his cabin. The sun was setting fast now, painting everything in shades of orange and red that made the world look like it was on fire. Jacob climbed down slowly, keeping his movements visible and predictable. "I'm gonna get some things from the house," he said, even though he knew she couldn't understand. "Medical supplies, bandages. You just stay there. Don't try to move. I'll come help you in a minute, but only if you let me. Only if you say it's okay." He walked toward his cabin, but before he reached the door, he heard her voice behind him. "Ingrid." One word, spoken so softly, he almost missed it. He turned back. She was looking at him now, really looking at him, her blonde hair falling in tangled waves around her bruised face. "Ingrid," she said again, pointing to herself. Her name. She was telling him her name. Jacob felt his throat tighten. In all the chaos and horror of the auction, of the purchase, of the ride home, he'd almost forgotten that she wasn't just a victim or a problem to solve. She was a person. She had a name. She had a life before this nightmare. She had hopes and dreams and a family somewhere across an ocean who probably had no idea what had happened to their daughter. "Jacob," he said, placing his hand over his heart. "My name's Jacob. Jacob Thornwood." He pointed to the cabin, to the mountains beyond, to the cattle grazing in distant fields. "This is your home now, Ingrid, for as long as you want it to be. And I promise you—" His voice cracked, and he had to stop, had to swallow past the lump in his throat. "I promise you, nobody's ever gonna hurt you again. Not while I'm breathing." Ingrid's blue eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, looking for the trap, looking for whatever cruelty was hiding behind the gentle words. But Jacob Thornwood had forgotten how to lie when they'd lowered his wife into the ground. Grief had burned away everything except the raw, honest core of who he was. And what Ingrid saw in his eyes wasn't lust or ownership or the dark hunger she'd seen in every other man who'd looked at her since she'd arrived in America. What she saw was pain that matched her own. What she saw was a man who understood what it meant to be broken. She didn't understand his words, but she understood his eyes. And for the first time in 6 months, since her father had sold her to pay his debts, since the ship had brought her to this brutal country, since the men had put that sack over her head and dragged her to the auction, Ingrid Halverson felt something she'd thought was dead forever. She felt a tiny, fragile spark of hope. Jacob carried Ingrid into the cabin like she weighed nothing, even though she was easily 170 pounds of muscle and bone, and every step made her gasp against his shoulder. He'd asked permission first, showed her his open palms, gestured to the house, mimed carrying her until she'd finally nodded, her face tight with pain and something that looked like shame. She hated needing help. He could see it in the way she tried to hold herself rigid, tried not to lean into his chest, even though her body was screaming for relief. The woman had been taught that needing anything from a man was dangerous. Jacob made a mental note of that, filed it away with all the other broken pieces of her story that he was slowly collecting like shards of shattered glass. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. One main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, and a bedroom separated by a thick wool curtain. Jacob had lived alone here for 8 years, and the space reflected that loneliness in ways he'd stopped noticing until now. No decorations on the walls, except a single photograph of Emma on their wedding day. No flowers in vases or quilts draped over chairs, or any of the small touches that made a house feel like a home instead of just a place where a man waited to die. He carried Ingrid to the bedroom and laid her gently on the bed he'd shared with Emma, the bed where she'd died giving birth to their daughter, the bed he hadn't slept in since. He'd been living in the barn loft for 8 years because this room held too many ghosts. But Ingrid needed it more than his ghosts needed protecting. "Wait here," he said, even though she had no choice. Her legs couldn't carry her anywhere, even if she wanted to run. He disappeared into the main room and returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and a bottle of whiskey that he mostly kept for nights when the memories got too loud. Ingrid's eyes went wide when she saw the whiskey, and Jacob realized she thought it was for him, thought he was going to get drunk first, thought that's what men did before they took what they wanted from women who couldn't fight back. No, no, he said quickly, setting the bottle down and showing her his empty hands again. This is for cleaning wounds, for medicine, not for drinking. He mimed pouring it on a cloth, dabbing it on his own arm, wincing at the sting. Understanding flickered in her eyes, followed by something that might have been relief. Jacob knelt beside the bed, moving slowly, keeping his eyes on her face instead of her body. I need to see where you're hurt, he said, so I can help, but only if you say it's okay. He touched his own ribs, his legs, his shoulders, then gestured to her with a questioning look. Ingrid stared at him for a long moment, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes. The desperate need for someone to tend her injuries, fighting against every survival instinct that screamed not to trust any man, ever, under any circumstances. Finally, with trembling hands, she pulled up the hem of her dress just enough to reveal her calves and shins. What Jacob saw made his vision blur with rage. The bruises were even worse up close, deep purple and black, some yellow-green around the edges where they'd started to heal, overlapping in patterns that told a story of systematic, repeated violence. These weren't the marks of a single beating. These were the marks of days, maybe weeks, of someone using her body as a target for their fists and boots. Who did this? Jacob's voice came out rough, barely human. What kind of devil puts hands on a woman like this? But Ingrid just shook her head, not understanding, fresh tears sliding down her bruised cheeks. Jacob forced himself to breathe, to push down the murderous fury that wanted to ride back to that auction and tear apart every man who'd been there. That wouldn't help her. Violence wouldn't help her. What would help her was exactly what he was doing right now, cleaning her wounds with gentle hands, wrapping clean bandages around her calves, murmuring soft reassurances in a language she didn't speak, but a tone she could feel in her bones. He worked in silence except for occasional warnings before he touched a particularly bad spot, giving her time to brace herself. And slowly, gradually, he felt some of the tension leave her massive frame. Her breathing steadied, her hands unclenched from the quilt. She was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he meant what he'd said. Maybe he really wouldn't hurt her. When he finished with her legs, Jacob sat back on his heels and looked up at her. There's more, isn't there? More injuries. He touched his own ribs, his shoulders, his back. Ingrid bit her lip, then slowly, painfully, she turned so he could see her back. Jacob helped her shift, his hands supporting her weight, and when she lifted her shirt just enough to reveal her torso, he had to close his eyes for a second to keep from being sick. Her ribs were a canvas of purple and yellow, and he could see at least two that looked like they might be cracked or broken from the way the bruising radiated outward. Her shoulders bore marks that looked like fingerprints. Someone had grabbed her, hard, over and over. And along her spine were thin, raised welts that could only have come from a belt or a whip. Jacob's hands shook as he wet a clean cloth and began washing the dried blood from her skin, being as gentle as a man could possibly be, with hands that were more used to roping cattle and chopping wood. He'd delivered calves and set broken legs on horses, and once stitched up his own thigh after a bad fall. But this was different. This required a tenderness he wasn't sure he still had in him. Emma had been the gentle one. Emma had been the one who could touch broken things and make them whole. Jacob was just a man who'd spent 8 years teaching himself not to feel anything at all. But Ingrid needed him to remember. She needed him to be more than the grief-hollowed shell he'd become. So he tried. God, how he tried. I don't know what happened to you before you ended up at that auction, Jacob said quietly as he worked, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. I don't know if your family sold you, or if you were taken, or if you came here looking for a better life and found hell instead. But I know this. You didn't deserve this. Whatever they told you, whatever made them think they had the right to do this to you, they were wrong. You hear me? They were wrong. His voice broke on the last word, and he had to stop. Had to press his forehead against the edge of the bed and just breathe for a moment. When he looked up, Ingrid was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear anymore. Something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, like she was seeing past his beard and his weathered face and his rough hands to the grief that lived in the center of him. Like she knew what it was to be hollowed out by loss. Like she understood that sometimes the worst scars were the ones nobody could see. Jacob finished bandaging her ribs, then stood and stepped back, putting distance between them. You should rest now, he said. Sleep. I'll be outside if you need anything. Just holler, I guess, or bang on something. I'll hear you. He moved toward the curtain, giving her space, giving her privacy. Giving her the thing she needed most, which was the freedom to breathe without a man standing over her. But before he could leave, Ingrid spoke. Jacob. His name in her accent, the hard consonants softened, the vowels stretched. He turned back. She was sitting up now, despite the obvious pain it cost her, her blue eyes locked on his face. Thank you, she said in English, the words careful and precise. Thank you. It was probably the only English she knew, and she'd saved it for him. Jacob felt something twist in his chest, something that had been dormant for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like. It wasn't quite hope, it wasn't quite happiness, it was just feeling. The ability to feel something other than the gray numbness that had been his constant companion since Emma died. You're welcome, he managed, then fled to the main room before she could see the tears in his eyes. He stood by the cold fireplace for a long time, listening to the small sounds of her settling into the bed, her quiet whimpers when she moved wrong, the eventual silence that meant she'd finally fallen asleep. And Jacob made a decision. He didn't know who'd hurt Ingrid Halverson. He didn't know why they'd sold her for $3 like she was worthless. But he knew this. Whoever came looking for her, whoever thought they had any claim on this woman, they'd have to go through him first. And Jacob Thornwood might be a lot of things, broken, haunted, half dead from grief, but he was still a rancher who protected what was his. And whether Ingrid knew it yet or not, she was his now. Not like property, not like something he owned, but like something he'd sworn to keep safe, even if it cost him everything. 3 weeks passed like water wearing down stone, slowly, persistently, changing everything. Ingrid's bruises faded from deep purple to sick yellow-green to nothing. Her ribs healed enough that she could breathe without gasping, and her legs grew strong enough to carry her around the cabin and eventually outside to the porch where she'd sit for hours watching Jacob work with the horses. He'd kept his promise about sleeping in the barn, hadn't crossed the threshold of that bedroom once since the first night, and Ingrid noticed. She noticed everything about this strange, quiet man who'd bought her for $3 and then treated her like she was worth more than all the gold in Montana Territory. She noticed how he always made noise before entering a room so he wouldn't startle her. She noticed how he left food on the table and then disappeared outside so she could eat without eyes on her. She noticed how he'd sit on the porch steps every evening with a battered book, sounding out Norwegian words in an accent so terrible it would have been funny if it wasn't so heartbreaking. He was trying to learn her language. This lonely American rancher was teaching himself Norwegian from a book he'd probably ridden 2 hours to town to buy, just so she wouldn't feel so alone. And Ingrid found herself doing something she'd sworn she'd never do again. She started to trust him. Not all at once, not recklessly, but in small moments that accumulated like snowfall. The morning she found him sleeping, sitting up against the barn door, because he'd heard her crying in the night and wanted to be close enough to help if she needed him. The afternoon he came back from town with fabric for new dresses, holding it out like an offering, his face uncertain as a boy's. The evening she caught him standing at Emma's grave with his hat in his hands, and instead of hiding her presence, she walked over and stood beside him in silence. Two people who understood that some losses never stopped hurting. That night Jacob didn't sleep in the barn, not because anything improper happened. It didn't. But because Ingrid had looked at him across the dinner table and said in halting English, "You sleep in house. Barn is cold. You are good man. Good man deserves warm bed." And she'd pointed to the main room, to the space by the fireplace where he could lay out bedrolls. Not the bedroom. Not yet. But not the barn anymore either. It was progress. It was trust. It was the beginning of something neither of them had names for. But trust was a fragile thing, and some men made their living breaking fragile things. Clayton Murdoch rode onto Jacob's property on a Tuesday morning with 2 hired guns flanking him and a smile that would have looked at home on a snake. Jacob was shoeing a horse when he heard the hoofbeats, and every muscle in his body went tight with a warning that sang in his blood. He recognized that feeling. It was the same instinct that had kept him alive through 2 winters of Indian raids and a range war that had left half his neighbors dead. Trouble was coming, and trouble had Clayton Murdoch's face. Ingrid was in the cabin, visible through the window as she washed dishes, and Jacob saw the exact moment Murdoch spotted her. Saw the way his eyes narrowed with recognition and something darker, something hungry. "Well now," Murdoch drawled, dismounting with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never faced real consequences. "Heard you bought yourself that Norwegian giant from the auction. $3, wasn't it? Hell, I was planning to bid higher, but you jumped in so quick." He spat tobacco juice into Jacob's dirt. "Got to say, Thornwood, I'm impressed. She's even bigger up close. Must be something, having a woman you can use like a workhorse during the day and still—" "Finish that sentence and it'll be your last." Jacob's voice was quiet, deadly, the kind of calm that meant violence was half a heartbeat away. His hand rested near the hammer he'd been using, and Murdoch's hired guns shifted in their saddles. They recognized a man who knew how to kill. But Murdoch just laughed. "Easy now, neighbor. I come in peace. Actually, I come with information you might find useful." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "See, territorial law says if you want to keep your property as a married man, claiming homestead rights, you got to prove that marriage is legitimate within 60 days of filing. Real marriage, not just buying some foreign woman and calling her your wife." Jacob's blood went cold. He'd filed the marriage certificate in town 2 weeks ago. A formality, he'd thought. Just paperwork to make sure Ingrid had legal protection if something happened to him. He hadn't realized it came with conditions. "And you got 53 days left," Murdoch continued, clearly enjoying himself. "After that, if you can't prove this marriage is real, and by real, I mean consummated, recognized by the community, all legal and proper, then your claim gets dissolved. Your land goes up for auction." His smile widened. "And I got first right of refusal on any property bordering mine. Means I get your ranch, Thornwood, and everything on it." The implication hung in the air like gun smoke. Everything on it, including Ingrid. Jacob's vision tunneled, his hands curling into fists. "You threatening me, Murdoch?" But Murdoch just tipped his hat, already mounting his horse. "Not threatening, informing. You got 53 days to make an honest woman of that giant bride, or she becomes available again. And this time, I won't let her go for $3. He wheeled his horse around, but paused for one last parting shot. "Pretty thing like that. Shame to see her go to waste on a man too broken to touch her. When you lose this place, Thornwood, and you will, I'll show her what a real man feels like. Jacob stood frozen in the yard long after Murdoch's dust settled, the legal paper crumpling in his white-knuckled fist. 53 days. 53 days to prove a marriage he'd never consummated with a woman who still flinched when he moved too fast. 53 days before Clayton Murdoch could legally take everything, the ranch, the land, and Ingrid herself. The thought made something primal and violent rise in Jacob's chest, but he forced it down because Ingrid was standing in the doorway now, her blue eyes wide with questions she couldn't ask in English. She'd heard the raised voices, seen the tension in Jacob's shoulders, and recognized the threat even if she didn't understand the words. Jacob. Her voice was small, uncertain, and it broke something in him. He crossed the yard in long strides, and before he could think better of it, before fear or propriety could stop him, he took her face in his calloused hands and kissed her. Not gently, not tentatively, but with 8 years of loneliness and 3 weeks of falling in love without permission, and the desperate need to prove to her, to himself, to the whole damn territory that she was his, and he was hers, and nothing, not Murdoch, not the law, not the ghosts of his past, would tear them apart. Ingrid gasped against his mouth, her massive hands coming up to his chest, and for one horrible second, Jacob thought she'd push him away. But she didn't. Instead, her fingers curled into his shirt, and she pulled him closer, kissing him back with a hunger that matched his own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob pressed his forehead to hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "I mean really marry me. Not just papers, not just for protection. Marry me because I'm half in love with you already, and I think maybe you feel it too." Ingrid didn't understand all the words, but she understood his eyes. She understood the way his hands trembled against her face. She understood that this broken, gentle man was offering her something nobody ever had before. A choice. Not ownership, not obligation, but choice. "Yes," she said in English, clear and sure. "Yes, Jacob." And when he kissed her again, neither of them noticed the first snowflakes starting to fall, covering the ranch in white, like the world itself was giving them a fresh start. 6 weeks later, they stood in the rebuilt barn surrounded by half the territory, renewing their vows in front of a circuit preacher and a crowd that had come to witness the impossible. A lonely rancher and his giant Norwegian bride who'd somehow found love in the ruins of their broken lives. Ingrid wore a dress made special for her height, white flowers braided into her golden hair, and when she spoke her vows in accented but perfect English, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Jacob's voice shook when he promised to love and protect her for all his days, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the barn erupted in applause that echoed off the mountains. That night after the guests had gone, and the barn stood empty except for hay and memories, Jacob carried Ingrid across the threshold of the cabin they now truly shared. She didn't flinch. She didn't tense. She simply wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered against his ear, "Take me to bed, husband." And Jacob did, closing the door on their past and stepping into a future neither of them had believed possible. Make sure you turn on that notification bell so you never miss a story like this, and tell us in the comments, what time is it where you're watching from, and what country are you in? We love hearing from you.